Mr. Carlisle, as far as the testing goes, you guys have tested your upper bandwidth, but you're still in the process of testing the lower bandwidth, correct? Those results aren't in yet?
To be clear, the technical working group testing, which was the industry testing, for all classes of devices, the lower 10 was tested. So we have a full set of data for all 130 devices. The further testing that needed to be done was for classified receivers that were not tested on the lower 10 in the independent government testing, and some additional validation testing as NTIA set out in its letter a couple of weeks ago.
My next question is, Mr. Taylor and Mr. Carlisle, you can comment too, and you talk a lot about, over the course of the next 5 or 6 years, there's going to be normal change out of devices, but in the aviation community, because they are so expensive, because of certification issues out there, there's still a lot of older devices out there that are working very well, and we hope work well into the future. But Mr. Taylor, can you comment on those? And you know the ones I'm talking about, the ones that came out in the 90s, the late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah, yes, sir. Normal service life for commercial aviation equipment, minimum is 15 years. We're required to support equipment for 15 years. Often it lasts much longer than that. As you said, it's incredibly expensive to make a change to an aircraft, to change a critical system like the GPS. And the larger the aircraft, the more complex the change. So those systems that predate this entire discussion are in the field in thousands. And I know thousands is not a big number compared to the numbers we're hearing in terms of equipment's fielded here, but it's 1,000 that you care about. It's airplanes that you fly on every day. Many of them have equipment that was developed long before this debate started, and to which no one knows the answer. I don't know the answer. I built it. I don't know the answer to its susceptibility. And that equipment will, in the normal course of business, be in service for at least another 5 years. Some of the old equipment, some of it for much longer than that. It lasts for a long time and it stays in service. On the spectrum, I just want to clarify something on the spectrum. The RTCA, as you said, the RTCA preliminary report, which was a quick report, said that if LightSquared, stays at the lower 5 megahertz of the lower spectrum, lower half of the lower spectrum, at very reduced power, you just impinge or don't impinge on the standards to which new equipment is developed, brand new equipment. If you go to the next 10 megahertz, next 5 megahertz, the lower band, its acquisition is affected, tracking might be affected. You go to the upper band, then acquisition and tracking is affected. RTCA said that at the full spectrum, there will be no GPS aviation service over the entire eastern United States and close to any major city where this system was operating. Today I heard for the first time again, the lower 10 megahertz is now the one that's contemplated. If the lower 10 megahertz is used at even the reduced powers that we're discussing, RTCA says, I say, you will have problems with aviation GPS receivers, even the newest ones that are in service today. And who knows what the story is with the older ones.
I'd like to correct the record on a couple of things. First of all, on what RTCA found, what it found was that the lower 5 was clear and that the next 5 megahertz for tracking was likely fine, but there could be issues with acquisition and further analysis was necessary, and FAA is undertaking that further analysis. The RTCA report did say that if we were using our upper 10 megahertz, then that could impact aviation. But unfortunately, this issue continues to be conflated into our new proposals to move down to the lower 10 at the power levels we were authorized to do in 2005. The other point that I would mention is on the aviation receivers and whether the older ones are better than the newer ones. One thing we found through the testing process is months and months and months ago when we were at the very beginning of this, I think we, like other people, just assumed, well, this has got to be old GPS receivers that just, it's old technology. Certainly the newer technology is better. Well, what we found out was that wasn't actually the case. Older technology actually is in some cases less susceptible to this kind of interference because it's not as wide open. The GPS industry has moved further and further into more and more precise equipment that requires you to pick up more GPS energy, requires them to look further and further into our band. And I'm happy to get further follow-up information on this to make sure I'm recalling this correctly. But my understanding is the older RTCA standards, which predated the currently applicable ones, are actually less open and have less wide open receivers than the ones that are currently authorized under the current standard, and that's the one that's being analyzed today. But I'll provide follow-up information on that to make sure that's correct.
Mr. Boykin, did you have a comment?
Far be it from me to spoil a really good party, but in fact I'm following along with the RTCA paper, and Mr. Carlisle is exactly accurate in his comments about that. But what it points out there is that there is a small margin for error. That same paper points out that traditionally, GPS being an aviation safety service, the analysis includes a 6 decibel safety margin as standard practice. I'm starting to see numbers here that are getting very small and a very small safety margin, so my comment to that would be back to the same comment we started with. There's a significant amount of testing that needs to be done, and as my colleague from the GPS manufacturer said, that isn't going to be taken lightly and isn't going to be done tomorrow.
Mr. Green, I'll give you the last word.
Well, we all know how much wireless internet to rural areas, as well as GPS is to the rest of the country, and how much of an economic impact. And like to go and follow everybody else and say that, you know what, more testing does need to be done, and I hope that we don't jump into a situation that gets everybody in trouble in the end.
I want to thank you all for participating today. The committee is going to very closely follow the action of the FCC and the LightSquared proposal, and I plan to send a letter to the FCC reinforcing the need for comprehensive tests of all types of devices to ensure that there isn't going to be any interference for small business GPS users. With that, I'd ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to submit statements supporting materials for the record. Seeing no objection, it is so ordered, and with that, the hearing is adjourned.